Hello and welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam. My name is Bill Dixon, member of North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated. My normal co-host and partner here, Vietnam veteran and scholar, Mr. Bob Matthews, had a run-in with the dentist and his mouth was full of stitches and so forth. He's not talking very well, so he's taking the night off. Hope you enjoy our show. I'm going to need your help tonight so I can get through all this. I'm going to ask you to call in or Skype in at 919-518-9773. I will need you to call in. And it's Computers 2K Voice. That's Computers, the letter 2, K as in kilo, voice. Now, the subject tonight is one that I need your help on because why did the United States of America fight in Vietnam? Now, my first thing was I put down, why does the United States fight a war in Vietnam? But then I got to thinking, well, we didn't have a war, which brings up another question. Why was it a conflict and not a war? You get just as dead if you get shot, or if you lose an arm, your arm is just as much gone. Why was it a war, not a conflict? And what was the cause of this conflict? So I need for you to call in and give me your opinion. I did some research tonight from the show, and I saw more opinions of what happened and why we were in Vietnam and the outcome of Vietnam than you would ever believe. A lot of conspiracy theories out there. Bob Matthews is our scholar. Me, I'm more in your face information. Didn't know a whole lot. When you're in Vietnam, only we knew what was right in front of us, what we were doing that day. As far as the big picture of Vietnam, I went over there as a private, came home as a sergeant, but I went over there as a private and didn't know anything about the big picture. Didn't even know where Vietnam was, for that matter. I just knew that they were having a war and it was hot. And then I got there and realized it was hotter than I had thought it was going to be. And so I didn't know a whole lot about Vietnam, but going out to talking to other Vietnam veterans and also to visit schools and teach teachers how to teach the lessons of Vietnam, been forced to go out and study the big pictures in Vietnam. Still not one of these Vietnam scholars that have studied everything from back when 1800s when the French took over and went to Vietnam to present day, but I do have a little knowledge. Bob's the one that asked all those deep psychological questions and so forth. I just asked plain questions. So I graduated from high school. Lord, who'd have thought it? And one reason I ended up in Vietnam was because I flunked out of college. And but I've been doing a lot of studying about Vietnam, like I said, talking to other veterans and so forth. So here we are tonight, and I need your help to call in and give me your opinion. Why we went to Vietnam? And you can give me an opinion, did we win or lose the war? I have my own opinions on that, and I have lots of information here tonight to share with you. I've got all kinds of information. What I want to ask you was the cause of the Vietnam War, I'm going to call it a war tonight because it's easier than saying conflict. Was it the Gulf of Tonkin? Was that the cause of going into war? You can't really use that because we've been there since 1950s. So the Gulf of Tonkin in 65 couldn't exactly be called the reason we started the war, and it never happened anyway. Was it communism, the reason we went to Vietnam? With communism, we were talking about the Domino Theory. Is that why we went? Was it a CIA misadventure? They were in the Vietnam or Indochina at the time. Was something that they did cause the problem? I have one guy who says it was all because of the Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to start right here and go that what these opinions are tonight that I'm going to share with you are not necessarily my opinions. Amnon Nissan or Nissan Communications opinions or the North Carolina Vietnam veterans or Bob Matthews opinions. I'm just sharing with you different opinions of research so you can do your own research and make up your own mind. That's one of the important things about the lessons of Vietnam. We put out the information as we know it and see it and give you a little bit of our opinions, but you need to do your own research and come out with your own answers. Most of the time there isn't a right or wrong answer. So tonight we're going to be talking about lots of things. Was the fact that we were able to fight the Cold War in another country We didn't have to go to Russia to fight it. They didn't have to come here. We kind of had a neutral ground, per se, to fight the war. The Cold War was called, actually, the Third World War. Was that the reason there? Did the war start because we were trying to build a nation? Did the war start, or us going into Vietnam, was it a political issue? Was it an economic issue? You know, there's a lot of people make a lot of money during the war, selling supplies and to each other and other ways of making money. Is that why we went into Vietnam? Was it self-serving by some politicians? Was there some other reason? Why do you think we went into Vietnam? And while you're doing that, I wanted to throw another one out at you. How do you fight a limited war? We're still trying to do that. And I have not figured out how you fight a limited war. And if you could tell me that one, I would appreciate that one too. And I think a lot of the people who are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and now Iran with the situation is how you fight a limited war. Who's limited? Which side is limited? Are both sides limited? One side limited? What are the limits? That's the way it was in Vietnam. The rules of engagement go along those lines. But before we get started on that, I want to throw out a few things to you. Most of you know that we just recently did the National Vietnam Veterans Day at North Carolina History Museum, the part of the 50th commemoration of the activities with the Pentagon and so forth. Great success. The museum, people liked it a whole lot. They've asked us to come back. Their attendance was up a tremendously amount for that same period of time, which we'd like to say that it was all because of us. We had lots of displays. We had to play. We touched a lot of veterans who came out with tears in the eyes. They turned around and went back in. Some had to stay out, but it's a great play, great weekend. We had a 1/8 version of the wall. We had displays and so forth. I want to really thank several people. And my new son, who has military vehicles restored. He was there one day with his Deuce and a Half, and then another day he was there with a Jeep. Charles Bullock, who drove to Goldsboro, North Carolina, early in the day on the first day and had his vehicles there on display, and then turned around and drove all the way back to Raleigh to the History Museum and had his vehicles on display. And then Brock Nichols brought in a helicopter, a Huey helicopter that he brought in, and we had set up out there. And every time I looked out there, they were as a crowd. I'm not certain if they even got a chance to go to the bathroom, or I know they didn't get a chance to see the play, because they were always full of people. It was like having a billboard out there. And I want to thank all of them for their efforts and so forth, since we're all a volunteer group. I'd pay them what they're worth, but it's a minimum wage, so I don't pay them anything. Also, the Peace University guys at Peace University, the young lady who was on stage with me, Katie, and Roger, and all the other people at Peace, you couldn't have thanked them for any of what they did and the time they spent. And it's unbelievable the time they spent for no money whatsoever, other than to put up with a bunch of old folks who didn't know how to act, but they taught us and so forth. So I want to thank all of them. If you're locally, Inlow High School is doing a very special play this weekend. It's called Miss Saigon. They have bought the rights to Miss Saigon. It is pretty much a professional, even though it's high school students, they have spent a lot of money and efforts getting everything set up. It is started tonight, and it'll be running through Saturday. My wife and I'll be there on Saturday at Inlow High School off Newman Avenue. I believe it's Clarendon. Come out and see the play. Tickets, I think, are $8 to come out and see Miss Saigon. Unfortunately, they couldn't get a helicopter in the school auditorium, but they got replicas of everything else, so it's going to be quite a show. Also coming up is the Fall of Saigon 40th anniversary. It's hard to believe it's been 40 years, but I just got this email tonight from a friend of mine, and it says, "Dear my good friends, we invite you to American veterans who fought in Vietnam to attend the ceremony commemorating National Day of Infamy, April 30th, 1975. The Day of Infamy this year marks 40 years we have left my country, South Vietnam. This ceremony will be held on Saturday, April 25th at Marsh Creek Community Center, 3050 North New Hope Road, Raleigh, from 11 to 2. And that's where they're going. The Vietnamese military and the Vietnamese people are going to meet and with special education of what's going on. But to them, it was the day they lost their country. Colonel Hein Vo, who wrote this, was at a machine gun as a major when Saigon fell. He spent the next 8 years in a re-education camp. Now I'm going to give you another opportunity coming up. On April 17th, we're going to be back at the North Carolina History Museum, and Colonel Hein Vo is going to be one of our guest panelists. He'll be talking about his 8 years in re-education camp. And then we're going to have 2 American POWs, Bill Schuette, who was in the Navy, and then we'll have General Norman Gaddis, who both of them have been on the show as guest panelists. That is April 17th at the North Carolina History Museum from 7 to 9 p.m. So I just want to let you know about a couple of those things that are going on, and you're not helping me out because you're not calling in and asking me all this, give me all your opinions and so forth. So you're going to make me do this whole show all by myself because you're not just going to come in and help me. But anytime now you want to call in, that's okay. I'm going to give you, today when I was doing research, the last couple of days for that matter, I found some interesting things, and this sums up war, especially the Vietnam War, in one paragraph. Now, it's not nice to read over the air, but I tell you, I want to read this to you because this tells you what war is all about. War is not what a John Wayne movie portrayed to its viewers. No cuts were called on a set where the dead and wounded got up. Blanks were used and blood was fake. War is what it was and still is today. Attrition, killed or be killed, IEDs, body counts, freedom birds, barred windows on buses to prevent VC sappers from throwing grenades in there, human wave communist charges, conscientious objectors, combat adrenaline junkies, Christians, Catholics, Jews, atheists, feats of incredible endurance, and so forth. There was in South Vietnam everything under the sun, courage and cowardice, immersion foot, leeches, salt tablets, Hueys, Cobras, tanks, APCs, FACs, Loaches, Sea Wolves and PBRs, ambushes, Aussies, ROKs, shit hooks, constant harassment and interdiction in artillery while you tried to sleep, 100-degree heat in the shade, carrying 60 pounds on your back and a steel pot on your head, sweat, blood, red clay, the stench of nuke bomb sauce and beetle nut, mosquitoes, scorpions, two-stepper snakes, swabbies, grunts, boots on the ground, airmen, tunnel rats, malaria, sea rats from World War II, beans and mothers, shit burning, hooch maids, chihoys, Kit Carson scouts, funny and tragic moments, permanent friendships forged, boom boom girls, countless operations, fire support bases, naval bombardments, foolish as well as good generals, Victor Charlie, carpet bombing of Art Like and Rolling Thunder, Arvins, Zippos, Medics, Dust-Offs, LZs, FSBs, FBs galore, West Pointer warmongering RMFs give unwise orders leading innocent soldiers to their premature death just so they could earn their stripes, malingers, shake and bake sergeants, gun trucks, AK-47s, M60s, and Phantoms, B-52s, OV-110s, napalm, Willie Pete, fragging, combat refusals, donut dollars, strippers, the black market, Dear John letters, peace signs and warmongers, artillery, howitzers, constantly changing MPCs, ambushes, good old Southern boys, the Bloods, City Boys, California Surfers, American Indians, Canadians, Latinos, Brits, Nungs and Yards, Air America, Spooks, LBJ, Claymores, Spooky, aircraft carriers, Yankee Station, M79s and 16s that jammed some soldiers even referred to rifles as Mattel toys, ambushes, carpet bombings, helmet and helicopter nose art, hippies, drugs, rock and roll, juicers, heads, brilliant and moronic COs, heroin, black VD, and the infamous 1,000-yard stare. Even Jack Daniels was there. There were no baby killers, though, a creation of Hollywood, Jane Fonda, and the peace protesters. I will post the good, bad, and ugly, and you can be sure it was all there. That explains the Vietnam War in one paragraph. About as good as you're going to ever get. That's about everything that came out in the whole War of Vietnam. Now, let's talk about what was the cause of Vietnam. Now, I'm going to pull out a couple of these that came out. Vietnam has to be the longest war because we actually started there in the 1950s. The United States Military Assistance Advisor Group, MAAG, the Army Security Agency, ASA, and the Temporary Equipment Recovery Mission and other groups, officials and unofficial, served from 1950 through 1964. They supported French efforts to retake its former colony following World War II, and then backed South Vietnam's efforts to deflect the Viet Minh and Viet Cong and North Vietnamese after the French were defeated in 1954. They gathered intelligence, trained soldiers, transported Catholic refugees out of the North, flew reconnaissance out of the North, cooked casualties, and were sent home with orders not to talk about their time in Vietnam. Temporary equipment recovery missions that primarily served as clandestine reinforcements for MAAG. All told, nearly 250 United Statesmen died in enemy action in Vietnam prior to 1965. Now, we don't hear a whole lot about these people. At least 60,000 men and women served prior to 1965. So 1950 to 1965, 60,000 men served in Vietnam. And most of us Vietnam vets and other historians really never think about those men because they had to come home and keep their mouths shut. I know for a lot of Vietnam veterans, it was hard to come home. Those who served from 65 on to come home and couldn't talk about your service in Vietnam because of war protesters and stuff. These men and women served between 1950 and 1965 and couldn't come home and talk about the war because of orders. Now, talking about forgotten soldiers, these people were the forgotten soldiers. So was there action there in Vietnam? Is that what got us started in Vietnam? The American Legion just came out with an article this month entitled Why We Went to War in Vietnam, which they're wrong in the fact that there wasn't a war, but that's technicality, I guess. And this is what they had to say about it. In the decades after the departure of the last United States combat troops from Vietnam in March 1973 and the fall of Saigon to Communist North Vietnamese in April 1975, Americans have been unable to agree on how to characterize the long, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful U.S. military involvement in Indochina. To some, the Vietnam War was a crime, an attempt by the United States to suppress a heroic Vietnamese national liberation movement that had driven French colonialism out of the country. To others, the Vietnam War was a forfeit, a just war needlessly lost by timid policymakers and a biased media. For many who study foreign affairs, the Vietnam War was a tragic mistake brought about by U.S. leaders who exaggerated the influence of communism and underestimated the power of nationalism. And now there's a fourth one. It's just recently moved. And that is that the Vietnam War is history and can be studied dispassionately by scholars. And what it says is, which is what I brought up a while ago, the synthesis interprets the war in the global context of the Cold War that lasted from the aftermath of the World War II, the fall of Berlin in 1989, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this view, Vietnam was neither a crime, a forfeit, or a tragic mistake. It was a proxy conflict for the Cold War. The Cold War was the third World War of the 20th century, itself part of what some have called the Long War or the 75 Years' War of 1914 to 1980. Unlike the first two world wars, the Cold War began and ended without direct military conflict between the opposing sides. Now, on our trip back to Vietnam, we spent the couple of days at a former VC's house. He and his wife were both VCs, and we spent some time talking to him and so forth. And he told us that he joined the Vietnamese or Vietnamese communists, the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong, because he was a nationalist and he wanted Vietnam to be all Vietnamese. And he joined to run the United States out, even though the United States was saying that they were not there to build a nation or to take over. They were there to help the South Vietnamese people, which I personally believe they were there for. But he joined the service of the communists, and he said after 30 days he realized he'd made a mistake. The Viet Cong, which were started out, a good part of those was the Nationalist Liberation Front, and they were nationalists. But unfortunately, the power was behind Ho Chi Minh's group. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, always a communist, even though we helped him run the Japanese out. We supplied him and General Jup with weapons and training and so forth to help run the Japanese out. Somewhat familiar to a little place called Cuba. That leader was also turned against us and was a communist, somebody by the name of Fidel Castro. Somewhat same thing happened in Vietnam. But even after the fall of Saigon and communism took over, they took some of the former Viet Cong, their allies, their friends, their fellow countrymen, and put them in re-education camps right along with the South Vietnamese soldiers, because they were still nationalists and didn't fit in with the communist regime's idea of how communism was supposed to be. So is that why we went to Vietnam and fought there? Because of the Cold War? I think it had something to do with it. When I was in school, we had to study communism because that was a deep, dark thing out there that we had to be aware of communism. So we actually had special courses on communism. The idea was the reason I was told we were going to Vietnam, I was told I was going to Vietnam because that's where they were sending me. But the background of that was that they wanted to have the Domino Theory, and the Domino Theory has been discussed at length over the last 45, 50 years or so, or probably longer than that, whether the Domino Theory was held in the water or not. The idea was if we didn't stop communism there, communism was continue to spread and take over. After World War II, when the Russians came in power so strong and with communism and in Red China, we went in to do anything we could to stop them from spreading communism, because it would take over and cause more problems. So the Domino Theory probably has a little bit of background to it, just like some of these other things, the communism, the Cold War, all this going on. I don't know if there's any one incident. Like I said, the Gulf of Tonkin has been proved not to happen. Here's another one here that says the cause of the Vietnam War. This one is by a group out of Illinois, education. Most Americans' wars have been obviously starting points or participating causes. The Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the capture of Fort Sumter in 1861, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, North Koreans' invasion of South Korea in June 1950. But there was no fixed beginning for the U.S. war in Vietnam. The United States entered the war incrementally in a series of steps between 1950 and 1965. In May 1950, President Harry S. Truman authorized a modest program of economic and military aid to the French, who were fighting to retain control of their Indochina colony. Part of also what threw into the effect there is the India getting its freedom from England and so forth, and the people of Vietnam and Laos and so forth got to see those countries becoming run by their own people, and they started looking at that and so forth. But when they at the end of World War II, the United States backed the French going back in, and then we paid for about 70% of the war. We had the people I mentioned a while ago. We had people at Dien Bien Phu. We were furnishing all the materials and so forth for the French. When they were beat and run out, then supposedly the elections were supposed to be coming along between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. But then the United States got really concerned because South Vietnam leadership was had some corruption problems, some internal problems with the family. The president put together his own force. His sister-in-law, Madame Nehru, when the monk burned himself, she mentioned something about a barbecue. They became the royalty of Vietnam rather than the president of Vietnam. I can't say that word there. The Prime Minister Diem, excuse me. My southern tongue has problems with some of these words. Diem and his brother and his sister-in-law, she was the first lady by proxy since he wasn't married, got so corrupt that the United States government kept coming in and telling them, warning them and so forth. And another point of contention is how much did the United States have into the dethroning and assassination of the family. Madame Nehru is still alive. She lives in France, but the Prime Minister, him and his brother were killed during the overcoming of the nation. For a while there was kind of a back and forth who was going to control it. But during that period of time, there was all this going on. They were supposed to be having elections. The United States was scared to have elections because the elections might allow the communists to come in and take over with elections, which would defeat the idea of stopping communism. So the United States never really allowed the free elections between the two countries, which made the countries more and more lined up or disaligned. But I want to bring out another Vietnam War timeline crisis, and we talk about going back to the 1950s. Well, in 1802, Vietnam timeline commences at this early date, establishing that remote facts may ultimately control the future. French bishop, a leader of Catholic missionaries in Tonkin, which was northern Vietnam, allied with Nguyen nobles to capture Hanoi and install a Nguyen who creates a new imperial dynasty. French commercial interests have a stake in a stable Vietnam. Now, I mentioned a while ago the Catholic Church. During my research, I came across, and I know I have it here because it's a big pile. Okay, there it is. I came across this very large book here, and I'm not going into that a whole lot. And what I would recommend you do is, I'm not speaking against the Catholic Church. I'm just telling you some of the things I have found in research here. This is by a man by the name of Avro Manhattan. He's dead now, so you don't have to worry about him. From 1914 to 1990. He was the world's foremost authority on Roman Catholicism and politics. A resident of London during World War II, he operated a radio station called Radio Freedom, broadcasting to occupied Europe. He was the author of 20 books, including the bestseller, The Vatican and World Politics. And it says here, the shocking story of the Catholic Church role in starting the Vietnam War. It's online. I went online and pulled this up. It's some interesting reading. It's a long reading, but it goes back to, the first Catholic president of the United States was John F. Kennedy. And during that period of time, there was an escalation of the war before he was assassinated. And you kind of go back and start thinking about just how much did the Catholic Church and the Catholic religion have to do with the war in Vietnam. Vietnam was mostly Buddhist and Cao Dai and several other religions, and then the Catholic Church started going in with the French. So that's another aspect of how the war got started and why it got started and so forth. And you people are not coming out, calling in and answering my questions. How did the war start? I need to know. Because there, like I said, there's so many different opinions out there is how the war began. Let's see. Going back to the timeline in the calls, it's amazing when you go on how many people give the calls to the war. Speaking of, President John F. Kennedy rounded another turning point in early 1961 when he secretly sent 400 Special Operation Forces, Green Beret soldiers, to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight what was called counterinsurgency war against communist guerrillas in South Vietnam. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, there were more than 16,000 U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam, and more than 100 Americans have been killed. Now, during that period of time, the word was advisor. which means we were not supposed to pick up a rifle and shoot back unless you were dire necessary of getting killed or not. But and we still lost. Then in February, March 1965, Johnson authorized the sustained bombing of U.S. aircraft of targets north of 17th parallel, and on 8th of March dispatched 3,500 Marines to South Vietnam. Legal declaration or no, the United States was now at war. But again, it was like the Korea. It was not a war, it was a conflict. I guess because Congress didn't declare the war and the president sent people in, kind of like we're having a little problem now, that they couldn't call it a war. I think it's just cutting semantics there. The National Liberation Front, who I mentioned a while ago, was the people who wanted the communists and Ho Chi Minh. Truman also hoped that assisting French in Vietnam would help to shore up the development of non-communist nations, which was another reason supposedly that we allowed the French to take over back to Vietnam, even though Ho Chi Minh was lobbying really heavy after World War II, to turn Vietnam over to Vietnamese. That Truman hoped that by turning it back over to the French, that they would be there to stop communism. But the between the two groups of the nationalists and the communists, and of course everybody heard of Dien Bien Phu, came about, and the French were kicked out. As presidents committed the United States to conflict bit by bit, many of his ambitions were forgotten. Instead, inertia developed against withdrawing from Vietnam. Washington believed that the United States withdrawal would result in a communist victory. Eisenhower acknowledged that had elections been held as scheduled in Vietnam in 1956, Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote. And no U.S. president wanted to lose the country to communism. Democrats in particular, like Kennedy and Johnson, feared a right-wing backlash should they give up the fight. They remembered vividly the tone of the Republicans' 1950 question, who lost China? Which brings us back into the political part of the war. Just how politically motivated was us being there. We've all heard the story, how do you cook a frog? You put him in the frying pan and you turn the heat up gradually. Well, that's kind of how we got to Vietnam. We sent some people over there, and then we sent some more people over there, and then we sent some more people and added to the people we already had there, and next thing we know, we had a full-fledged war. Again, it goes back to, it's hard to pick a date when the war started. Did it start in 1950 when we first sent men over there? Just what was the beginning of the Vietnam War? If you look back at 1950, we started Vietnam War was 20-some years long, about 25 years long. That's a long war. And just how did it come about there? There's so many aspects. I'm not certain from all the research I've done just why there's any one thing. It's all seems to go back to that same one thing. Let's stop communism, the domino effect, the Cold War. Let's fight the Cold War in Vietnam. The Chinese and the Russians were sending in advisors. They were furnishing equipment all during the war. So in effect, it was somewhat of a proving ground for weapons. The United States was developing weapons. The Russians were developing weapons. The Chinese were developing weapons. And it was kind of let's try the weapons out, but rather than try them on each other, let's try them out here in Vietnam. So that's, you look at it that way. It was kind of a proving ground for weapons and a proxy war between the three countries. Why didn't we go into North Vietnam? Well, when when we went in Korea, we had pushed the Koreans back, and then we decided to go over into the edge of China because it's kind of like going into Cambodia or Laos there. We said, we're going to go right on the edge of China. We're going to get rid of these guys. And then the Chinese got mad because we're invading their country. And I think that the reason we fought this limited war is that we didn't want to go into North Vietnam because we didn't want to make the Chinese mad, and we had to fight the Chinese along with the North Vietnamese people. And I'm not certain, we weren't already fighting the Chinese because of the weapons that were being used with the AK-47s and the MiGs and all that sort of stuff that were flying between in North Vietnam. So Russia and China was already supplying weapons and advisors. I know people who actually saw some of both during the period of time. There was actually Cubans coming in and doing some of the interrogations of POWs. So we were already fighting a war with the Chinese. It just wasn't a full-scale war. I guess if we'd fought the Chinese, they might have called it a war instead of a conflict. It's kind of crazy out there just how they come about. Let's talk about the domino theory one more time here. The domino theory was the basis for the United States strategy of containment and reason for ending the Vietnam War. This is what these people say that we ended the Vietnam War for. As far back as January 1951, for instance, the then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs had defined the domino thesis in these terms. It is generally acknowledged that if Indochina were to fall, Burma and Thailand would follow suit almost immediately. Thereafter, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for Indonesia, India, and others to remain outside the Soviet-dominated Asian bloc. Then we move down here to the White House finally asked the Board of National Estimates for its view on the domino concept. We do not believe that the loss of South Vietnam and Laos would be followed by the rapid succession communization of other states of the Far East. With the possible exception of Cambodia, it is likely that no nation in the area would quickly succumb to communism as a result of the fall of Laos and South Vietnam. Furthermore, a contentment of the spread of communism in the area would not be inexorable, and any spread which should occur would take time in which the total situation might change in any number of ways. Moreover, the extent of which individual countries would move away from the United States towards the communists would be sufficiently affecting the substance amount of United States policy. And this is something that was very interesting. In the spring of 1995, former Secretary of Defense Robert Mcnamara, you remember Robert Mcnamara, he was the guy that led the war. He was also the guy that Ford Motor Company come up with the Edsel. So that kind of gives you an idea of how smart he was and so forth. And if you haven't seen the Edsel, guys, you need to go online and look up one. It was a Ford named after one of the Fords, and it was the grill was up and down. It kind of looked like a car sucking a lemon. Look to it, and it was an absolute disaster for Ford Motor Company. So the United States government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that McNamara did such a great job running Ford Motor Company, we're going to let him run our war. And he says here that he believed the domino theory was wrong. I think we were wrong. I did not believe that the Vietnam was important to the communists. I don't believe that its loss would have didn't lead to communist control of Asia. Today, it's clear to me that my memorandum pointed directly to the conclusion that though either negotiations or direct action, we should have begun a withdrawal from South Vietnam. When you got government saying one thing and government saying the other, it's kind of hard to go by that little thing called domino theory. One says it is and one says it isn't. It's just like I mentioned a while ago. It's kind of like rear ends. It's everybody's got one, and everybody seems to have a theory on the domino effect. Again, we haven't come to a conclusion yet. Just how did we end up in Vietnam? We got all these things out there that are going on and so forth, but how did we actually end up in Vietnam? Why did we end up in Vietnam? Still can't figure out why we're in Vietnam. Was it domino theory? Was it Cold War? Was it the Catholic Church? You're not helping me out a whole lot with my thing here as far as telling me how you think the war ended. What I want you to do is, those of you who are watching the show, I appreciate you watching the show. I'd like for you to go do some of your own research and come back on another time and tell us why you think the Vietnam War did what it did and why we supposedly lost the war. Now I'm going to go to a jump here a little bit, but did we lose the war? Well, let's see.
Before you go for that,
okay.
I asked the question in our podcasting group, and Mike was saying, first he said it started in the 50s. I said, not when.
Yeah.
How?
Well, in 1950s, after we're into World War II, rather than Ho Chi Minh went to the accords there and said, hey, let's give Vietnam to the Vietnam people. But they knew he was communist, so they gave it to the French instead, because the French were already there and got run out by when Germany took over to France, and they had to pull people out of Vietnam, and then the Japanese went in there, and so when the war was all over and the Japanese and the French were out, most of it was Vietnamese there, but the powers that came up with NATO got together and said, well, let's let the French go back in there and use it as a French colony rather than the Vietnamese people, because they can keep it from going communist. And that was the rationale.
So some people will say that Mike and me are old, but he's younger. So then he's saying, I don't have an intelligent response. He says, what I remember is Johnson used advancing communism in South Vietnam as an excuse to start a war. Now, he did not start it, right?
No, it was actually started back with Eisenhower and Truman. Truman before was Eisenhower. We were actually there, as I mentioned a while ago. There was some, Kennedy had made the statement that he might pull the troops out of Vietnam, which everybody kind of wondered after he got assassinated just where that came from. But Johnson fell right in with everybody else. And originally, Mcnamara and everybody else was talking about the Domino Theory. And Johnson and the Democratic Party didn't want to come up and say who lost Vietnam. We already said who lost China. So they had to kind of keep right on going so that the communists wouldn't take over and didn't lose Vietnam. It got political. It was probably political a whole lot all along, but it got to the point at that point that to save face, that Johnson had to send more troops in. And at the end of the war, when Johnson decided that he was not going to run again and Nixon was going to run, they were at the peace tables. Nixon actually, through the Chinese, if you remember, one of the first things that Nixon did was put in a friendship with the Chinese, and he went to China. He was one of the first presidents that ever went to China, and so forth. So
played ping pong, was that him?
Yeah, and he told the Vietnamese through the Chinese, if you'll wait till I'm elected, you get a better deal for the Paris peace talks. And then a little thing came along called the Watergate.
But we're digressing.
So the common belief that the United States lost the war in Vietnam. In fact, the American military was not defeated in Vietnam. The American military did not lose a battle of any consequences. From a military standpoint, it is almost an unprecedented performance. General Westmoreland, quoting Douglas Pike, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, a major military defeat for the VC and NVA. The United States did not lose the war in Vietnam. If you remember, we pulled out. The South Vietnamese, after the U.S. Congress cut off funding. What happened was Kissinger and Nixon went in there and promised the South Vietnamese people a lot of things. When they signed the peace accord, Dong Ha, where I was recently there in just past May, was already in the communist hands, which is in South Vietnam. It was south of the DMZ. We allowed Dong Ha to stay North Vietnamese or communist. We allowed the communist forces to stay in South Vietnam. Now, how do you have a peace and call it a peace with honor when you allow the enemy to stay in the other country? But then we promised the South Vietnamese people we're going to pay them all this money and take care of them and send them supplies and so forth. And then along came the Watergate issue, and Nixon had his own problems. And let me go a little bit more into the peace accords here. The South Vietnamese ran out of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies because of lack of support from Congress. The fall of Saigon happened April 30th, 1975, 2 years after the American military left Vietnam. The last American troops departed in their entirety 29th of March 1973. That is the combat soldiers. The peace settlement was signed in Paris on January 27, 1973. It called for releases of all U.S. prisoners, withdrawal of United States forces, limitations of both sides, inside South Vietnam, and a commitment to peaceful reunification. The 140,000 evacuees in April 1975 during the fall of Saigon consisted almost entirely of civilians and Vietnamese military, not American military running for their lives. There were almost twice as many casualties in Southeast Asia, primarily Cambodia, the first 2 years after the fall of Saigon. Now, you hear all about how the Americans killed all the Vietnamese people. It looks to me like here that the communists were killing more of their own people than the Americans were during the war. Thanks for the perceived loss and the countless assassinations and torture visited upon Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians goes mainly to the American media and their underlying support by the misrepresentation of the anti-war movement in the United States. As which much of Vietnam War, the news media misreported and misinterpreted the 1968 Tet Offensive. I was there. I will know how it was misdone. It was reported as an overwhelming success for the communist forces and decided defeat for the United States forces. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Despite initial victories by the communist forces, the Tet Offensive resulted in a major defeat of those forces. General Von Nguyen Yip, the designer of the Tet Offensive, is considered to be some as ranking with Wellington, Grant, Lee, and MacArthur as a great commander. Still military, the Tet Offensive was a total defeat of the communist forces. At that time, we'd been fighting the Viet Cong as well as the North Vietnamese, mostly the Viet Cong down in the Delta areas. But after the Tet Offensive, if they won, why was the Viet Cong basically wiped out as a fighting unit? They had to bring in North Vietnamese soldiers to supplement the South Vietnamese guerrillas because the Viet Cong as a fighting unit were basically wiped out. The Tet Offensive succeeded only in one front. That was the news front and the political arena. This was another example in the Vietnam War of inaccuracy becoming the perceived truth. However, inaccurately reported, the news media made the Tet Offensive famous. It's, as we say, Walter Cronkite turned against the war. I believe Nixon said, I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war. How did the Vietnamese people think about what went on? This is a letter from a young man that was a boat refugee who later joined the United States Navy. And he says here, please accept my sincerest apologies. I struggle to grasp for the words to convey how honored and grateful I am to have this opportunity to personally write to you. It's been an emotional journey for me, especially these recent years with the discovery of new friendships from the war in my former home, Tutam Orphanage in Pleiku, a complex mixture of emotions suppressed and unaddressed for over 4 decades. Although I was very fortunate to find refuge in the United States with my surrogate grandmother, I found the effects and devastation of the war, the loss of my biological family, and its aftermath had profoundly handicapped me for most of my life, always lingering in the distance and in the memories of a frightened, fragile child. It's with great gratitude I personally thank each of you, for my husband, Michael, of 20 years, and my 4 beautiful children, for my beloved adopted country and my freedom. For the vital principles that you taught me of your example of courage and strength by your love and devotion to your family, your service to not only your homeland, but to the children and people of the Republic of Vietnam, and most important to God. Thank you for allowing me to shed the tears buried within my soul to missing my homeland, Vietnam, to express my sorrow and grief with you for your loss, and to finally convey to you that I am forever indebted to you and all that you sacrificed. This is from a Vietnamese who was a boat refugee. I've got another one here. So the South Vietnamese people appreciated us being there, and if you deal with the Vietnamese people here today, there's 17,000 in the Triangle area, you see that they appreciated us being there. And if you go back to Vietnam today, the people in the South still appreciate us being there. I want to read something real quick here because we're running out of time. The reason that Saigon or South Vietnamese fell because of the United States Congress completely changed. In August the following year, in 1974, Nixon resigned his office as a result of Watergate. 3 months after the elections came the November congressional elections, and with them, the Democrats won a landslide victory. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing. I'm just reading you what the facts were. Had promised, Congress made many of the members won a landslide victory for the new Congress, and many of the members used their new majority to defund the military aid U.S. had promised. Piece for piece, breaking the commitment that we made to South Vietnam and Paris to provide whatever military hardware the South Vietnamese needed in case of aggression from the North. Put simply and accurately, a majority of Democrats for the 94th Congress did not keep the word of the United States. On April the 10th, 1975, President Gerald Ford appealed directly to those members of the Congress in an evening joint session televised to the nation. In that speech, he literally begged the Congress to keep the word of the United States. But as President Ford delivered his speech, many of the members of Congress walked out of the chamber. Many of them had investment in America's future in Vietnam. They had participated in demonstrations against the war for many years. They wouldn't give aid. And during that period of time, the Russians and the Chinese were pouring into South Vietnam tanks, anti-aircraft guns, all kinds of equipment, and so forth. And then the people of South Vietnam, after we promised them that we would look after them and help them, Congress just shut the door and wouldn't even talk to them. Former Arkansas Senator William Fulbright, who had been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made a public statement about the surrender of South Vietnam. He said this, and I quote, "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas." That's the fall of Saigon. That's what he felt about the Saigon. He didn't care more than about the fall of Saigon and the 58,000 men who gave their life for the freedom of South Vietnamese people than he would be between two football teams. The U.S. knew that North Vietnam would violate the accords, and so we planned for it. We did not know what was that our Congress would violate the accords and violate them of all things on behalf of the North Vietnamese. That's what happened. Now, did we lose the war? Did Congress give the war up? Just what was the end of the war was almost as confusing as the beginning of the war. When did it end? When did it begin? There's so many things out there that affect it and so forth, and there's so much myths and mistruths between the war protesters, the news media, who we used to call them Saigon Follies. Not many of the news media actually went out into the field with the combat troops. Most of them sit in the bars of Saigon and Caravel Hotel, the Rex Hotel, and the Majestic Hotel, and drank until 5 o'clock on a Friday, and they all went over to the Pentagon, Vietnam, and got the briefing of what was happening from the officers there. And of course, that wasn't always true either, what they were told, but that's all they got was what, and then they went back and wrote up their own opinions. I think that was the beginning of news media going, instead of reporting the news, they started reporting their opinions. News and opinions got tied in together. And that's why Walter Cronkite, as I call him, Walter Cronkite, turned against the war, and that turned the American people against the war. And here we are today trying to figure out really what caused the war and how did it end. The communists have got Vietnam right now, but communists, as far as Vietnam, is a little different than what communism here, but don't make no doubt. Vietnam today is communist. The people of Vietnam do not have freedoms. They got more freedoms than a lot of the other communist countries, but they don't have freedoms. And freedom of speech or freedom of weapons, Second Amendment, or any of these things, but they are alive. But how many people do you know escaping from the United States to go over to other countries? Answer the questions to yourself. How did the Vietnam War start? When did it start? Why did it start? And did we lose or win the war? Like I mentioned a while ago, opinions like rear ends, everybody's got one. And hopefully tonight's show gave you a little bit of background to go in and do some research and come up with your own opinions. Do some research, come up with your opinions, and call in on another show, and Bob and I both here, and tell us what you came up with. When did the Vietnam War start? Why did it start? And why was it a war? Why didn't Congress get behind and go, okay, we're going to declare war? I'm not certain what difference it would have made. A dead guy, 58,000 some odd names on the wall, didn't care whether it was a conflict of war. I didn't care whether it was a conflict of war. All I knew was that I was going to this place I knew nothing about, where people were shooting at me, and they did, and then tried to blow me up too. And that's what it's all about, and thank you for tuning in tonight, and we have one more.
I have a question.
Okay. Amnon has a question.
All these people that left, that ran out, do you know anybody that went back to visit?
Some of the people have gone back now. For a long time, the South Vietnamese people, who are boat people, were not welcome back. I forgot the name in Vietnamese they were called, but it was kind of like, it wasn't a dirty name. But now the communists over there have decided that the Vietnamese boat people have come to the United States and made a lot of money.
Oh, so they
So
want
now
that.
they like that money when they go back and spend. So you've got a lot of South Vietnamese who go back now who still have family there. Some of the boat people still have family there. So they go back to help their family out, and they take American money back and help their family, which the communists likes and so forth. But for a long, long time, they kind of frowned upon the refugees going back. They didn't want them back, but now they love for them to go back. Now, there are some who could not go back because of political reasons. As I mentioned a while ago, Colonel Hein Vo, a good friend of mine, he can't go back because they probably put him back in jail again. We recently had one of our members go over to Vietnam trying to help out the South Vietnamese soldiers. He wasn't arrested per se, but he was called into the police station and interrogated extensively and told to leave Saigon because he was trying to help the South Vietnamese soldiers. So communism is better hidden. If you go over there as a tourist, it looks like everything is wonderful. But if you talk to people who have gone back over, South Vietnamese people, or people who have been able to talk about what's going on in Vietnam, there's still a lot of oppression there, and the police is still pretty much a police state. The Montagnards are treated worse now than they were when South Vietnamese had them. So
That's because they were helping the Americans.
yeah, we're helping the Americans, and they were always treated pretty bad. But the thoughts now is more for money than it is ideology. I wouldn't think that a South Vietnamese, a boat refugee from here, a Vietnamese American now would go back and start preaching freedom and democracy and so forth. He would probably disappear somewhere, and we'd never hear him again. But they are welcoming them back now, but for a long time they won't. We're looking forward to seeing you on the next show, and hope I gave you something to think about. Y'all have a good evening, and hopefully next time my partner and fellow Vietnam vet and scholar will be back with me, and we're getting into some deep material. But be sure to come to Miss Saigon or to the April 17th at North Carolina History Museum. I'm looking forward to that. It is going to be quite a night to hear Hein Vo talk about his re-education camp or his slave labor camp and the things he had to do and so forth for 8 years that he went through. Good evening.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Health In with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, The Tanya Love Show, Your Healthy Pet with Gisela DiCarlo. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at www.nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by Atomus.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters for professionals, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.